Please be seated. Good morning. I'm very privileged to be with you this morning, and I'm very grateful for the kind invitation of my two friends and brothers, Father Bill and Father Phil. We met in the Southwest where I live, and they were kind enough to invite me to share just a few words with you today. I remember I preached in this pulpit once in the summer of 2011, and the gospel that had just been read was the account of the widow's mite. And if you're familiar with that text, I think it was in Mark, it says, Jesus seated himself opposite the treasury. And I looked out that window, it was a summer day, and the door was open. And I said, well, this is just a setup, huh? A perfect chance to preach. But I have another good chance today. What we have in this presentation of John the Baptist, who's often used in the Sundays before Christmas, is really the role of the prophet in general. They're always doing what he is described as doing here. Bringing down the high places and filling in the low places. You could call the prophet a highwaymaker. They're leveling the ground so that people can walk on it. They're trying to make access easier. And I'm sad to say that isn't always been the function of religion. A lot of our history has been to, in fact, list requirements and place frames and doorways and sometimes, frankly, obstacles. Always, if you do this, if you do that, then you can have access to the Holy One. The prophet's job is always to keep humanity free for God and God free for humanity. It's both directions. And only good theology and good spirituality keeps God free. You wouldn't think God would need to be kept free. But our temptation, especially I'm sure Phil and Bill would agree, our temptation as clergy is often to tie God up and precede the message with all kinds of ifs and ands and buts and parenthetical clauses so that the proclamation is hardly a joyful proclamation at all. It's not an accident that this passage quoted from Isaiah says, the voice of a prophet is one crying in the desert. It's always spitting into the wind. It's always shouting into a culture and an age that's never ready to hear it. And that's why Jesus says in another place, you're going to kill all the prophets, or you did kill all the prophets, and now you're going to kill me. Because they always speak an octave higher than the rest of us. I think that was a phrase from Walter Brueggemann, who said that the prophet always speaks an octave higher. I read a book some years ago. I'm sure I didn't totally understand it, but it's a classic. Some of you probably have read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I'm not scientifically trained, but I did the best I could. But the point that did make total sense to me as a clergyman was he said that scientific revolutions do not proceed by a straight line. There's always a major deconstruction, a major falling apart of the previous paradigm. He almost popularized the word paradigm, a whole frame inside of which we think. And he said, it's rather discouraging if this is true, that frankly, a new scientific worldview doesn't proceed real quickly because basically the holders of the previous paradigm have to die off. That's how tied the human ego is to its opinions. I think the Alcoholics Anonymous people call it contempt before evaluation. As we listen to our politics, and it isn't a hard case to make, I think we see a lot of contempt before evaluation. We've decided who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. We don't want an open road. We want to create in religion and politics as many obstacles as possible. So the refugees can't pass through, the poor can't pass through, the people of color can't pass through, the gays. There's always a reason. It's hard. It's hard work to build a highway for God. Now, I'm told that this change of vocabulary, and some of you can check me out on it if it's true, only occurred in the last 25 years. But before the Jewish prophets, and unfortunately after too, the main understanding of justice was what we call retributive justice. It's all quid pro quo. It's all, you did this much good, you deserve this much reward. You did this much bad, at least we Catholics relegated them to purgatory for a certain amount of days or years. It all had to be measured and counted and weighed, and that's what I call meritocracy. And that's frankly the way Wall Street works. It's the way the whole country works. If we're honest, it's the way we work too. We're all counting and measuring and weighing. And it takes a major deconstruction to move out of that world. You can go to church most of your life and still stay in the world of meritocracy. To swim in the ocean of grace, an open highway where you stop counting, is for most people a major conversion. And I wouldn't say, in my experience, I don't mean to be too cynical, but I don't think the vast majority of Christians ever go through that transformation. They never walk on that new highway. Now, our word for that, the word that I've only found in vocabulary in the last 20, 25 years, is restorative justice. Now, that was taught us by the prophets. It came from these guys, who, they're always reaming out Israel. It's really, you got to hand it to the Jewish people for incorporating these prophetic books into their Bible, because they don't say much good about the Jews. It's always telling them you're bad, you're wrong, you're sinful, you're going to hell in a handbasket. It's never good news. But if you stay with them, it is good news, because their response is not inside the frame of retributive justice. It's so unusual that I think most of us read the prophets and don't even see what they're saying. Because the answer to the sins of Israel on the part of Yahweh, the God of Israel, is always not punitive, although some passages appear that way. But when you look in the overall text, it's always, I'm going to love them more. I'm going to outdo them with generosity. So they have to come to me. So they have to be converted and live. It's not based on the punitive model that we all are, frankly, quite familiar with and probably agree with. But the prophetic message is quite simply restorative justice. We now see some of our bishops teaching this in strange places, not necessarily in the big cities. I know that our bishops in New Zealand are very good about it. You almost got to be off the beaten track to dare to speak. You got to shout in the desert about restorative justice, because frankly, we don't like it. It doesn't make sense. When people do bad, you should punish them. That's retributive justice. That notion of justice makes sense to every one of us in this room, me too. Restorative justice? To actually love people out of their evil? That takes too much time. It takes too much grace. It's too impossible. I'm not even sure it always works, but it doesn't seem that Yahweh is asking the question whether it always works. God's job is simply to operate according to who God is, to be true not to the object, but to his own subjectivity, who he is, she is. And that will always be bigger than our mind is ready for. In fact, as many of our saints and mystics have said, if you do understand God, or God's logic, or God's ways, then you know your God is not God. Would you respect a God you could understand? This God will always be mystery, will always be bigger than our hearts are ready for, or our minds are ready for. So let's pray. We're not now the generation that has to die off before the new good news can be proclaimed. Let's pray that we're not the generation that has to pass before we can build a giant highway to God. And from God, too.